Hey everyone, thanks for being with us on a Saturday. Welcome to Free Assange Vigil 42.3. My name is Steve Poikinen and I'm joined this morning by my co-host Andrew Smith. Our guest will be here in about 45 minutes. Today marks 23 days until the second round of Julian Assange's extradition hearing. It is 3,427 days since the beginning of the illegal and arbitrary detention of the WikiLeaks founder. This is 377 days since the trafficking of Julian Assange to Belmarsh prison following the $4.2 billion IMF loan to Ecuador. We are at 1,057 days since Reality Winner was taken into federal custody for leaking information. And on the positive side, today is 44 days of freedom for Chelsea Manning, who was finally released when the 10-year-long WikiLeaks grand jury investigation was closed. As I mentioned, we are going to be joined later on in the show by Mohammed El-Mazi and Alex from Red Star Radio and Kitty Hundel. But before then, we're going to go ahead and go through some news that we haven't been able to get to during the course of the week. And we are going to start with everything Craig Murray has ever written is now being used to charge him with contempt of court. This is absolutely insane.
And this is with the Craig Murray thing, as we're getting that pulled up, just to kind of give a little backstory behind it. The UK has very specific laws about court reporting. A lot of times they put gag orders, like we saw with the reporting on Julian Assange's partner and children, but we'll do that across an entire court case. And I don't know specifically about what the case was that it was being reported on, but from the way that Craig was describing it, and we'll get into that here in a minute, Alex Salmon. And the way that Craig had been describing it in this defense article that we're going to be going through is that they didn't even step in while the court case was going on to file this contempt of court against him. It was something that they brought up afterwards. So do we have that up on screen? Yeah.
Okay, I'm not muted. All right, so let's kick this off. Murray says, I know of 4 pro-independent folk who were last week phoned or visited by Scottish police and threatened with contempt of court proceedings over social media postings they had made weeks back on the Alex Salmon case. Then on Monday, a Scottish journalist I know had his home raided by 5 policemen who confiscated and still have all his computers and phones. They said they were from the Alex Salmon team and investigating his position or his postings on the Alex Salmon case. He has not been to date charged, and his lawyer is advising him at present to say nothing, so I am not revealing his name. Then on Tuesday morning, a large police van full of police pulled up onto the pavement right outside my front gate while I was talking on the phone to a senior political figure about the raid on my friend. The police just sat in the van staring at my house. I contacted my lawyers, who contacted the Crown Office. The police van pulled away and my lawyers contacted me back to say that the Crown Office had told them I would be charged or officially cited with contempt of court, but they agreed there was no need for a search of my home or to remove my devices or for vans full of police. On Thursday, 2 plainclothes police arrived and handed me the indictment. Shortly after, an email arrived from the Times newspaper saying the Crown Office had confirmed that I had been charged with contempt of court. In the case of my friend whose house was raided, he was contacted by the Daily Record just before the raid even happened. I'm charged with contempt of court, and the hearing is 7th July at the High Court in Edinburgh. The contempt charge falls into 2 categories. 1, material published before the trial liable to prejudice a jury, and 2, material published which could assist, quote, jigsaw identification, quote, of the failed accusers. Plainly, neither of these is true motive of the Crown Office. If they believed that the material I published was likely to have prejudiced the jury, then they had an obvious public duty to take action before the trial, and the indictment shows conclusively that they were monitoring my material long before the trial. To leave this action until after the trial, which they claim the material was prejudicing, would be a serious act of negligence on their part. It is quite extraordinary to prosecute for it now and not before the trial. Let's kind of break that down a little bit, Andre. Get your thoughts on that.
This is what I was referring to. This portion here, where the UK has specific gag laws about how a journalist can report on a court case before, during, and after. And in this one, it seems like he was posting information that they thought may prejudice a jury, that may give a jury a specific point of view or specific facts that may or may not be omitted in court. So what they decide to do in the UK, which I personally don't agree with, but it is what it is because it's their laws in their country, they say, hey, you can't report on this case to the public because we don't want it to affect the way that the public views it before it actually happens. And that's where that threat to prejudice a jury comes from. The latter half, I'm not too specifically sure on about the jigsawing the accusers or however it words that. And I think that has to do more with revealing information that the court didn't want out, but I'm not entirely sure on that one. But the simple fact that he was literally on the phone with someone discussing the fact that this had been happening across multiple countries and then happens to him at the time that he's discussing it is really telling, because it's something that we all know that the intelligence communities monitor everyone, especially a man who has the balls, quite frankly, and gratefully so, to go and give live breakdowns of Julian Assange's court trial. And the work that he does is as prolific for any case that he decides to pick up and cover. So it's not inherently a surprise that they would try to get him with something like this, but the fact that they're still going after journalists while we're a week and a half out from World Press Freedom Day and a little over 3 weeks out from the start of Julian's trial.
Well, and here's this. I mean, this is one of those situations where if you're Craig Murray, who has been really out in front of not just this case, but more specifically the Julian's case, this seems like on top of a way to silence journalists in general, it seems like a direct message to Craig Murray going, look, we may not be able to get you for your work on Julian Assange, but we're going to make you pay as a result for anything you've ever written. Because again, there was a tweet out where he was explaining this and gave the link to the defense fund, and somebody asked him, so is all your material being used, as evidence that you're in contempt of court? And his response was, everything I've ever written is now a part of this. So they've already, the Crown Office has already gone way far outside the scope of material related to the Alex Salmon trial. It'd be fascinating if it wasn't so horrifying. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. This is the kind of stuff that like really intense graphic novels or movies are based on.
It seems like it's an attempt to stop him 3 weeks from now from covering Julian Assange's trial and to try to intimidate him about that. Because that's the thing that in the recent last 3 or 4 months was his greatest pieces, was the man in the gallery. It was him that put forth, among others, wonderful, well-writ, concise pieces about what the judge had said and how Julian had been treated. So this is definitely an intimidation attempt, at least in my opinion, to try to silence him from doing that again.
Yeah, because when Murray writes, he's not He's not like Mo, who will be joining us here in about a half an hour. Murray writes incredibly personally. He's not just there to, okay, this is what happened in chronological order, who, what, when, where, why, boom, done, journalism, you know, which is, you know, the way that factual reporting is supposed to go. Murray puts a personal touch on everything and relays his interpretation of events through his articles, which is the kind of stuff that I prefer to read. And it's the kind of stuff that I would write when I was a working journalist. Having said that, you can get bit in the ass pretty hard by personalizing your content. And Murray has been able to go through his entire journalistic career relatively unscathed by doing that. But you're right, Andrew. This is more of a, we don't want you around in 3 weeks when Julian's trial goes forward. We don't want your interpretation of events to get out into the public sphere, because he's a very persuasive writer. He's a very prolific writer. Yeah, this is, I don't know what the journalism laws in Scotland are. I don't. But look, here in the United States, a jury has pretty much been prejudiced before a hearing ever happens anyway. You know, like what Murray does is not the sensationalism that the US media does, or like the Daily Mail in the UK does. It's a very sober, very, you know, rational accounting of what happens. He's just got a magnificent style. But if it was like Court TV or TMZ or whatever, you know, any of the hack outlets that we have here, their job is to over sensationalize a case and thoroughly muddy the jury pool. That's what they're there for. That's not what Craig Murray is there for. So it's weird to me that his particular brand of journalism, all of it, the entirety of it, is being held as evidence of contempt.
Well, that's because he does actual journalism. That's because he'll actually investigate a story and present facts and say, hey, this is what's going on, and here's my opinion on it. So it's terrifying that it's something that they're doing, and it's terrifying that it's something that they have the power to do, which is to silence journalists about court cases. But it's also, at least to me, an equally desperate move as it is scary, because it shows that they're trying to figure out ways to stop this, because he's one of the people that does excellent work. So it's as much as the old line of censorship is a good thing because it'll make people try to find you more, I guess, in a way.
If we could go back to the article, I want to touch on a couple of informative paragraphs. As for identifying the failed conspirators, I have done less than the mainstream media, but plainly the Crown Office or whoever is pushing them into this persecution had no genuine interest in protecting the identities. Otherwise, why did they tip off the media that I was being charged and thus guarantee further publicity? If protecting the identities was their motive, to tip off the media would obviously be counterproductive. But what proves that the Crown Office is acting from base motives and not those stated is the one-sided nature of this. Only supporters of Alex Salmond, the Alex Salmond found innocent by the jury, are being pursued by this continuing Police Scotland operation. There are literally thousands who put out Salmond is guilty and Salmond is a rapist and Salmond is a pervert posts on social media before and during the trial. Not one has had the police knock on the door. The Herald published absolutely deliberately the day before the trial a montage of Alex Salmond amongst photos of mass murderers. They have not been charged. Every newspaper published Jigsaw identification information, which I withheld. I'll explain Jigsaw identification here in a moment. They have not been charged or investigated despite the evidence brilliantly compiled and presented to the police. No, this is a blatant, one-sided political persecution. That much is entirely plain. I have therefore decided, in the interest of open justice, to publish the entire indictment against me with a single sentence redacted where I think the prosecution were excessively indiscreet. Neither the indictment nor the covering letter is marked confidential or not for publication. It is, so far as I know, a public document, which, by the way, really looking forward to that. What they mean by Jigsaw identification is if you publish enough innuendo or leading statements or almost like half-ass information, then the reader can put the pieces together and they themselves can make an identification of the person or people that they're alluding to. So it's Jigsaw identification is basically like what we would refer to as breadcrumbs. Does that make sense? I don't know. If it makes sense in the chat, let me know. But that's what he's talking about. It's just a little bit more eloquent way of saying, you know, breadcrumb trail.
And that in and of itself is a weird thing to have against the law. Like giving people just enough information to make them try to think critically about a situation is kind of how that feels like it could be broke down to me. Like there is the other aspect of willfully omitting information to try to spin it a certain way, but that's just the propaganda that the mainstream media does anyways. So it's just strange that they can have those anti-Jigsaw laws.
Well, and as Murray points out, they're only applied to the journalists they don't like. They're not being applied to any of the higher profile people or regular people or outlets that were all on board with Alex Salmond is guilty, Alex Salmond is a garbage human being, or he's a murderer or pervert or whatever. It's only to the people who were saying it looks like this guy is getting railroaded, it looks like this guy is, you know, innocent, blah blah blah. So it's intentional, as Murray says, persecution of journalists who were trying to make sure that some semblance of actual, real, genuine justice had been carrying out during this hearing.
Do we want to jump into his indictment document?
Yeah, here, let me get that up. Okay, share, boom. Okay. Having considered the foregoing petition in chambers, Lord Turnbull, having considered the foregoing petition in chambers, grants warrant for serving a copy of deliverance on Craig Murray and appoints the petition to be heard on 7th July. Let's see. Where's the actual complaint, though? Here we go. Humbly sweareth that on 23rd January 2019, Alexander Elliot Anderson Salmond was arrested by police officers in relation to a number of incidents that had taken place in Scotland. Serious sexual offenses, including attempted rape. Alexander Salmond was committed for further examination and admitted bail. Let's see. Where's the part about Murray? On 10th March 2020, issued an indefinite order on the following terms. The court, on the motion of the advocate deputy, there being no objection, made an order at common law and said in terms of Section 11 Contempt of Court Act, preventing the publication of the names and identity and any information likely to disclose the identity of the complainers in the case. Since 23rd August, a number of articles connected to or referring to the criminal proceedings have been published on the website craigmurray.org. The website is believed to be owned and operated by the respondent. The articles all bear to have been written by a respondent. The website presents as a blog. The website includes an image of the respondent. Okay, where's the actual thing? On 5th March, the respondent sent an email to the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service that was also posted on the website stating, I am arguably the most read journalist in Scotland. We have undoubtedly the most popular and most read new media website in Scotland. Our regular readership is higher than any regular readership of the Scotsman or the Herald, on a good day higher than any Scottish newspaper. Made reference to the case.
And it even makes reference to him covering Julian Assange. And that part 7, where it says, last week our daily coverage of Julian Assange's hearing reached many millions of readers around the world. On March 7th, the respondent stated on the website, I am indeed one of the most widely read journalist residents in Scotland. So it even brings up the fact that he is a well-understood, credible source on Julian in and of itself, while referring to all of the other things about Alex.
The 23rd August article includes a section which purports to be an investigative journalist report about the case from a friend of the respondent. The report states that the author will be unable to comment until the case is over, but wishes to make comments on earlier civil case. The author states in layperson's terms, it looks like Salmon was being fitted up by officials in the government once he led with such distinction. He once led with such distinction. Following the inclusion of the report, the respondent writes, the Salmon affair indeed stinks to high heaven, and that's redacted. He continues by making a reference to the criminal investigation, suggesting it has been subject to influence and motivated by malice or politics, stating, I am not amongst those whose faith in the fairness of the police and prosecutorial system in Scotland, who has faith. In my view, the centralization of Police Scotland made it highly susceptible to political influence. So yeah, I mean, they're pulling bits and pieces out of his writings in order to put together a contempt indictment. And look, this is laughable. I mean, this is the kind of thing that they hand out to VIPs on the regular too. And I don't think Ray or Benny or John has had to go to court over this yet, but they were issued a subpoena, and you can refuse a subpoena until they try to give you a contempt court. They skipped over that process, or they don't have that process, and went straight to the contempt charge, which is pretty interesting.
And I don't know too much about this case in and of itself, but the way that Craig breaks it down and talks about how Police Scotland put 22 officers full-time on trying to dig up historical dirt on Salmon. To me, that comes across being a lot like what Liz broke down on Thursday's vigil about how the intelligence communities will influence people to then bring up dirt and bring up bullshit charges and all of these other things. And I don't know the details of Alex's case, but just by the way that it's laid out, it's very much smells like an intelligence community kind of thing.
Well, and here's the part where they started barring Craig Murray from making court appearances. On 19th March 2020, the advocate deputy brought the publication of the 19 March article to the attention of Lord Justice Clerk, who took the view that a prima facie case had been made that a prima facie case had been made out that a contempt of court had been established, and as such ordered that the respondent was not permitted to enter the court for the remainder of the proceedings. The Lord Justice Clerk Interim made an interim order in the following terms: the court, on the motion of the advocate deputy, there being no objection, made an order in terms of the contempt of court at 1981, section 4.2, preventing the publication of the details of issues raised in legal submissions that took place within a closed court between blah and blah 19th March. Said order to be put in place pending the resolution of trial proceedings against the accused Alexander Anderson Salmon. The respondent was subsequently not permitted access to the court. At 11:34 hours on 19th March 2020, a message was posted by the Twitter account CraigMurray.org with a link to the article along with the following comment. I have been barred from the court on a motion of the prosecution for possible contempt. I asked the friendly police who removed me why, and they didn't know. I have not been charged and know of no reason you should not read my last report. Also, at the same time, he was barred from attending the case management hearing of Julian Assange. And we've talked to Mo and Tarek, and have had a couple of people who were in that courtroom that have flat out lamented the absence of Craig Murray in these proceedings, specifically because he was able to put such an articulate face on what was going down in the courtroom. So this is, I mean, look, this is the targeting of a journalist who, by his own admission, is one of the most read or the most read in the entire country of Scotland. They're going after his Twitter postings. They're going after all of his articles. And look,
and this is on top of what Twitter does to suppress independent journalists, which is shadow ban, remove followers, derank tweets. So it's literally the larger establishment of censorship saying, hey, there's an issue. This guy's still talking, even though we've tried to shut him up. And then that's where these court cases come in behind the scenes now. Because it's something that they could have just had Twitter or Jack just shut off his account during that time, which is something that we saw with the World Press Freedom Day with Unity for Jay last year. It's something that we've seen with Susie Dawson's account getting attacked and just tons of other supporters.
It would be really, I'm sorry to cut you off, but it would be really interesting to do some digging on these accounts that are attacking Murray here that we're seeing on screen right now. Because these are all people who are going after and framing Murray's statements and work as you're trying to out these women. Yeah.
And it's pretty sad that a court is literally now digging through tweets to try to find a way to make a reporter guilty.
Well, look, we knew that early on in the history of social media, or at least some of us did, that all of this stuff is permanent and all of this stuff can be used against you. Now, there are people who flat out don't give a damn about that and will put their entire life on social media to their own detriment. I would say. Yeah, and then they're just going through and trying to build the case around social media posts and his work. So Craig Murray started a defense fund. We'll go ahead and get that up before we're done.
I'll drop that link in the chat for everybody watching right now.
And that's how Craig Murray introduced it. It's right up. I think it's right up at the top of the article. Okay. But yeah, and that's how Craig Murray introduced all of this. Is he was like, "Hey, I've got reason to have a legal defense fund. Here's why This should give you an insight, though, on how the court system, through police and their superiors in government as well, build a case against journalists. And if you are a passionate supporter of the truth, or you're a passionate supporter of Julian Assange and the truth, or in Murray's case, getting the story right about Alex Salmon, what you say on social media is going to be grabbed and twisted and then compiled with they're going to go through the entirety of your postings to find things that maybe relate and maybe don't. But the ultimate goal is to poison the well for any jurors who are going to come along and view the material. If you stack it a certain way, it makes it look like what you were doing was much more nefarious than it may have been. This again is another example of punishment by process. First, they barred him from appearing in court, and not just the Salmon case, but Julian Assange case. Now they've got him under indictment. Now they've got him on the phone with his legal team and tied up in future court proceedings. They're trying to prevent Craig Murray from doing the job that he has done so immensely successfully over the last several years.
And if not prevent, at least intimidate, because it's something that maybe the next time that a court thing comes around where he has the ability to call it out, they're hoping that if they put something like this against him now, that in the future he would self-censor or hold something back or not talk about a specific person or issue. So it even goes deeper into the psyche of the person, saying like, okay, how do we scare them into getting them to shut up if we can't just full out arrest them?
I'm trying to get the next article pulled up on my end. I don't know if you want to introduce that, Andre.
Yeah, so this is the Reporters Without Borders Free Press Index. And the UK recently dropped in rankings. And it says that it's following the murder of journalist Lyra McKee. So the UK has dropped 2 places from 35th out of 180 countries in the Reporters Without Borders 2020 World Press Freedom Index, published today. Although the UK government played a key role in promoting the idea of media freedom globally, its efforts were undermined by the domestic developments, including the murder of Lyra McKee and the active threats to the safety of journalists in Northern Ireland and the detention of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who faces possible extradition to the US. And just that there should be a reason to rank the United States and the UK the lowest of the 180 countries on the Reporters Without Borders list. But it continues that in 2019, the UK co-hosted the integral Global Conference for Media Freedom and co-founded the Media Freedom Coalition, which were significant steps in the global promotion of media freedom. However, a number of domestic concerns undermined the UK's international leadership role and resulted in the decline of ranking in the 2020 index.
So I just checked, and in 2017, the UK was ranked 30th. The United States was ranked 43rd, and in this most recent one, UK obviously 35th, United States 45th. Land of the free, right? I look, Judah Freelander, who's he's stand-up comic, documentary filmmaker, and oddly enough, homeless Bob on the show 30 Rock. Is a hilarious guy. When I posted about this, the UK's dropped, the US has dropped. He said, look, if you subtract 4 from 5, that makes number 1. So the United States, still number 1. Because you have to have jokes, otherwise you'll go insane. Anybody arguing that we have even a veneer of a free press in the United States outside of the handful of us that do independent media because we believe in the proliferation of accurate information, not because we want to grift rubes on political horse race coverage 24/7. Outside of that small pocket of us, we're as lockstep and authoritarian and self-censored and censored by management just as much as who's on this list? Let me pull it up. Where the fuck did it go? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm going to just keep reading through while you're looking for it.
Okay, I will note that Israel is 88th in press freedom, which is fairly interesting. Just on the note that if you've ever been around a certain type of idiot, you'll know that 88 are the initials HH, which stands for Heil Hitler, which is what skinheads write all over the place. So Israel being 88th is particularly hilarious to me.
So the murder of journalist Lyra McKee in Derry, Northern Ireland on the 18th April 2019 marked a staggering low point in press freedom in the UK, where a journalist had not been killed in the line of duty since the assassination of Martin O'Hagan in September of 2001. Journalists who cover organized crime and paramilitary activities in Northern Ireland continue to face serious threats to their safety. Although the Department of Digital, Culture, Media, and Sports announced in July it would establish a national committee for the safety of journalists and a national action plan on the safety of journalists, no apparent progress has been made towards launching these initiatives. The sentencing of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange to a disproportionate jail term of 50 weeks for breaking a bail also marred the UK's press freedom record in 2019, as did the Home Office's decision to greenlight the US extradition request. Assange remains in custody at the high-security Belmarsh prison despite widespread international concerns for his health and safety, including the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. With the coronavirus and other converging crises presented unprecedented threats to press freedom globally. It is more important than ever for the domestic states to lead by example. The UK should be performing better on the World Press Freedom Index and must address the domestic concerns as a matter of priority. Concrete steps should be taken to ensure that the safety of journalists in the wake of Lyra McKee's murder and Julian Assange should be released, and certainly not extradited to the U.S., the RSF UK Bureau Director Rebecca Vincent said. RSF also noted concerns over problematic provisions of the counterterrorism and crime legislation adopted in 2019, as well as the pursuant by the London Metropolitan Police Department of the publication of leaked information from the domestic cables as a criminal matter. Diplomatic cables. I love being dyslexic, guys. But so I want to give a big shout out to the Reporters Without Borders for being willing to drop the UK's rating on this index. I know they're not necessarily a political organization in and of themselves, but just having the ability to say, like, no, the UK's fucking up is something that I think is super important. And I hope that the attacks against Craig Murray and all of these other journalists serve to lower that a little bit further, because it's something that is directly under assault from literally every direction at this point.
Well, and Reporters Without Borders has been pretty late to the game in terms of mentioning or covering Julian Assange. So it's nice to see them come around to this. is they just recently, like very recently, mid-March, issued a statement decrying the persecution of Julian Assange. They're I think the last press freedom group to come on board after people have been addressing it both politely and impolitely for a very long time. And it's the same thing with like Amnesty International, who finally put out a petition back in January and February after immense public pressure for them to do so. The amount of leverage that state governments and global intelligence, that entire global intelligence apparatus that we talk about so much, have on press freedom institutions and have on organizations like Amnesty, it is just, it's a heavy weight. So when these organizations come out and stand up for Julian Assange, it's because they've finally realized we're next. And that's a message that we need to keep hammering home to the journalists who are towing the line every day. You're next is one of the things that we did when we were in DC. We were when we were in front of the Washington Post and we were in front of the Hill and those other outlets. We were trying to get them to understand that this is not about Julian Assange. This is about the future of press freedom. And Julian Assange is the person that they're using as an example, which is why they've spent the better part of a decade or more smearing the heck out of this guy, giving him fake charges, making him do a ridiculously draconian and unfair bail skipping sentence on a bail skipping charge that was in and of itself trumped up. I want to take a moment to call out one media figure, because Andrew did chase her down in the middle of the street, talk to her, and ask her to support what we were doing, and that's Crystal Ball. Because she's not only a very influential figure, she carries a celebrity that goes beyond progressive or woke or left media, because she comes out of MSNBC and she works for an organization that is a right-wing organization. She's seated next to a very fundamentalist right-winger in Cigar and Jetty, and it's hard to tell who is whose foil in this situation. If you're a fan of Crystal Ball, politely let her know that you would like to see more and honest coverage of Julian Assange. Please, if not for us, for Julian and for the rest of journalists in general. Like, there's a few people who are influencers who could really help drive this home, and I do believe that she's one of them. But I do believe that she's one of those people who's planned out her career well in advance of ever having gotten to the position to where she is. So,
and with the second half of the extradition hearing coming up too, it's extremely important that every independent journalist and independent media creator, regardless of political spectrum or ideology, put themselves up in front of this and cover this as the necessary and absolutely evil case that is happening. Because if hell isn't raised about this, if we just continue to talk about all of the other political bullshit, the horse and pony show and the lesser of two evils and all of the other just shit that funnels downstream, people aren't going to know about Julian's case. Most people, regular, average, everyday people, don't even know what's happening in Julian's case right now, specifically because the mainstream media has decided to not cover this. And it's something that the independent media we'll cover it when a headline comes up. Like when Pamela Anderson went on The View, it turned into a thing in independent media for 12 hours to talk about it. And I had hoped that it would start a larger wave of content discussions. But unfortunately, all it seemed to do is create that little period where they'll talk about it in that time, and then it just falls by the wayside again. So I hope that every creator will start picking this up and running with this, because if not, it's pretty much over.
Let's see, what else do we have for new? I'm gonna go into the challenge. Huh? Cool. I'm gonna go into the Challenge Power Initiative thing here real quick, and then we'll welcome Mo and get to talking with him. So here are, and this is stuff that we've talked about, but now you've got a direct link to a website that will lay it out for you in bullet point form. People ask us all the time, like, okay, look, we're up against a wall here. We're just one person, or we're this little group or little faction of supporters. What can we really do to help Julian Assange? The Challenge Power Initiative has your back. Donate to official fundraisers, guys. We know that right now it's really, really hard for almost everyone who's watching this to donate. If you can, though, please do. They've got links to the Don't Extradite Assange campaign, to WikiLeaks, and to the Kearns Foundation. If you can't donate, we tell you this all the time when we put up GoFundMe's for the people that we have on the show too. If you can't donate, please, please, please share the links, because the further out into the ether these links proliferate, the better the odds are that people are going to be able to contribute, even if you can't. Send emails and letters. Write to your political representative, human rights organizations, media, and workers' unions. And this is something that is really, really important. We have not tried to bring in unions to this in a large scale. I know that there's a better campaign going on over in Europe to do that. Julian Assange will be extradited to the United States if he's extradited. The U.S. is where he's going to land. So if you're in the States and you're listening, it's time to start putting pressure on unions. They have a kit for automatic emailing tools. And again, all of these links are available on the website. I know that the link got dropped into my chat. I assume it did on the other ones. They have templates. Like, guys, this is, you don't have to do hardly any of the work. There are 8 different letter templates that they've got to the chief magistrate. They've got to the UK Attorney General, the International Criminal Court, the Australian High Commissioner to the UK, the Australian Prime Minister, and the NHS Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They got a whole list of email addresses that you can write to. There's a number of petitions that you can sign. And then they've got a handful of links where you can go to get some updated news. I could add like 15 links to that, by the way. Challenge false reporting in the media. This is something that Christine Assange has suggested as well. Like, politely but firmly fact check in real time. Christine Assange has suggested as well. Like, where's that coming from? Firmly fact check in real time. Christine Assange has suggested as well. Let's not do that then. Back to the whatnot. Yeah, challenge false reporting. Yeah, you have to, like, if you're on social media, push back every time there's a hit piece, and join protests, start your own support group.
And I would say with Challenge Media, share those articles with independent content creators too. When you see a bullshit smear piece get ran, push back against it and send it to as many people to try to get a story ran that debunks everything that bullshit is about too.
Yeah, because the format, and look, in my opinion, it's a lazy format, but it's successful. Which is probably why these guys have way higher numbers than Slow News Day. But it's a lazy format to take a badly written piece and wag your finger at it and point out all the things that are wrong with it. And it's a format implemented throughout the entirety of alt media. So because they're already doing it and because they already have a set pattern of how to go about it, please directly hit up content creators with these hit pieces so that they can do their thing, which is wag their finger at it and point out what's wrong with it. My hope has always been that segment will be followed up by here's what you can do to make a difference, but that never freaking happens. So let's see if we can't get that to happen. We are millions. Please do that. It takes like 10 seconds. You get behind a white background. You print out a free card or a free piece of paper. There's a number of different suggestions. I am Julian Assange. We are all Julian Assange. Free press, free, yeah, all of these things. And you upload it to the handful of different We Are Millions websites, postcards, and write. Guys, we're not 100% sure if Julian's getting his mail right now, but the times that he does, they're overflowing stacks of letters from supporters. And as a person who has been locked up before, I can promise you that getting communication from the outside world helps keep you going. At this point, I think we should introduce our friend and recurring guest and writer reporter extraordinaire, Mohammed El Mazi. Mo, how are you doing today?
Well, thank you. Somewhat embarrassed every time I hear you say writer extraordinaire, but you know, I'll take it
I can be
nonetheless.
more flattering. I want to see you turn red, buddy.
So, yeah, it's good to be here. It's I've just been sort of brushing up on the subjects that we'll cover during our discussion, but it's good to hear the tail end of what you've been speaking about as well. If I could suggest one thing, I would suggest that people who people's letters to say politicians are most effective if they are targeting the people within their constituency. So if you're American and you're from Nebraska, targeting your politicians who might then end up putting pressure onwards on the Trump administration or what have you, or even getting a statement out in Congress because they've received so many letters. So like an MP here, I know members of parliament here are much more likely to respond. You know, if people who vote in their district, and this is what I've heard from people who've done lobbying in the States as well, right? That politicians respond irrespective of their own beliefs on an issue. They're much more likely to respond if it's somebody who is within their voting constituency who are contacting them on a matter. So, I think that's worth bearing in mind. Target your politicians.
So, Mo, I'm really interested in getting your perspective on this because we spent the first, 30 to 45 minutes going through what's happening to Craig Murray right now. We scrolled through his indictment for a little bit and read over his defense fund article. And I was just wondering if you could weigh in on the situation that Craig's facing because he's recently got some contempt of court charges pressed against him for reporting on Alex Salmond, I believe the gentleman's name was, and that case where he was giving a counter perspective to what the mainstream media was pushing out at the time in regards to it. So I was wondering if you could highlight maybe some of the weird UK laws surrounding court trial reporting, but also your thoughts on Craig's case.
So I won't go into details, at least for now, on the specifics of Craig's case. I will see at some point if I can speak to him, at least privately, and then go on from there. But I do believe we have in the past on this program discussed that the Contempt of Court Act, which restricts the type of reporting that people can engage in at certain times once a trial has started, and it will be different if it's a judge trial versus a jury trial. Um, all law of England and Wales, but Scotland, which is part of the United Kingdom, has its own criminal legal system. And then, of course, you have Northern Ireland as well. So there's, if you like, the four countries or the four nations that make up the United Kingdom. I can't quite remember how the rules apply in Scotland. But I'll give you an overview, and I'm sure it's quite similar anyway. And for all we know, it's the exact same Contempt of Court Act. When you have you have rules in terms of how the kinds of things you can say about the judge, for example, at least during a trial, when it's a judge, at least when it's a judge-only trial, let's say it's a magistrate's case, for example, extradition hearings, like in Julian Assange's case. But more importantly, when you have a jury trial, there's certain things that you can say and that you can't say. So you're not supposed to say anything. You're not supposed to be publishing anything that the jury hasn't been presented with yet. And when I say anything, obviously within limits, anything about the case which could prejudice the jury and which they haven't been presented. I'll give you one example. Let's say that somebody is being charged with a crime, and the jury has yet to hear, or may never hear, depending on what the judge decides, that the defendant has a previous conviction for that same offense, right? You can't report in the press if the jury has not been presented with that evidence, and the case has already begun, and the jury has already been impaneled. It's contempt of court if you publish in the press the fact that, well, he's already been convicted of this offense once before, right? That's a violation of the Contempt of Court Act, right? So I'm not saying that's what he did, but I'm saying just to give people an idea in terms of the types of restrictions or reporting restrictions, that's what they're known as, in terms of court trials, in terms of the types of things you can discuss. So I'm not going to go. You guys may have already discussed the specifics in terms of that.
The other thing that I had some questions on in regards to the UK's way that they handle court reporting and things like that is the term jigsawing. And it seemed like it broke down into essentially laying out bits of information and hoping that the larger story can be revealed through the smaller pieces that you set up. Could you talk a little bit about the jigsawing perspective on this too?
I can't actually. No, that's the first I've ever heard of that.
Okay.
I mean, to be honest, I've done more time working on court cases when I was working with other lawyers than working on court cases as a journalist. It's actually much more recent that I've even started covering hearings as a journalist, with the Assange case being a most notable example. So I'd like to do more, but I'm not historically a court reporter. So actually, I don't have that. Because of my experience in law, I wasn't even fully aware of lots of the court reporting restrictions because I was, I did I did some interaction with the press, but it tended to be about things that had already happened in court. And I was so consumed with dealing with the case, I wasn't aware of the media side of things, if you like. So
because it seems like
I can't answer that. I'm sorry.
It seems like a really convenient way to almost leverage the system against political enemies, in particular journalists that are willing to, I don't know, break stories and go against the mainstream line. Do you think they're just in the UK as a whole? Do you think that may be the case where sometimes contempt trials may be brought against someone specifically because they're a good reporter and not necessarily because they're, I don't know, reporting something dangerous?
Well, I would say, I mean, generally speaking, reporters tend to be quite cautious of these things, at least if they're aware. Now, because you have so much more citizen blogging and citizen reporting, I think lots of people just will be unaware even of these rules and laws. That's why they need to be sort of magnified so that, because lots of people in this country will be completely unaware of the fact that they're reporting such things as reporting restrictions. Um, Now, in terms of how they could be used and abused, it's going to be quite interesting to see how this case goes on. Like I said, this is in Scotland, mind you, which is a separate criminal jurisdiction from England and Wales. It will be interesting to see how this case develops. I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure how many other cases of contempt of court as a result of the nature of reporting that there have been over the past, say, like 10 years. Um, the primary reason for it, and right now I don't have enough evidence to think otherwise, I don't have any reason to suspect otherwise, that even if the contempt of court laws could be used, as you say, to silence or to punish certain types of reporters or people who engage in certain types of reporting, the primary purpose is to safeguard the fairness of the trial, right? So that the jury does not get exposed to certain pieces of information that might prejudice them, so that if a judge decides that evidence shouldn't be presented to a jury because it's overly prejudicial to the defendant, that press have to be able to respect that. So I don't know what it's like in the United States. I mean, obviously you have 50 states and 50 different legal jurisdictions and interpretations of the First Amendment, right? Because obviously you've got the federal constitution, but also local state constitutions. But I do know that quite often the press will report on things that the jury isn't allowed to hear, right? Like they will say, well, the jury won't be allowed to hear the fact that he has a prior conviction of rape, right? Whereas over here, the whole point is that to help prevent the jury from being exposed to that information, you do have these reporting restrictions. So I think there is a legitimate argument. I'm not going 100% in favor of the Contempt of Court Act. I'm just saying there is a legitimate argument that when a trial is in full swing and a jury has been paneled, that certain types of reporting should be restricted. I think there is a case to be argued in favor of those rules, and that the law in and of itself is not necessarily designed to just come down to prevent independent reporting or reporting that is from outside of the box. I hope that kind of answers for that. I know you were asking about specific silencing of journalists, but I don't have examples of that.
Yeah. Oh no, that's not a problem. It's just in the actual indictment for Craig, if that's the right word for it. They cited his work in amplifying the court case of Julian Assange, specifically showing how he reached millions of people during the first week of Julian's extradition hearing. So it was just the way
So
that
that might be to prove. I mean, that is interesting that they would pick that. Yeah. It could be coincidence, or it could be killing two birds with one stone. But that would be, I think, to prove that he has reach. So if they're saying, look, in the case of First Minister Alex Salmond, it's not insignificant. We're not going after this guy who has a blog that like one man and his dog has access to. You know what I mean? So like, I think the argument would be there might be a need to satisfy like a particular legal test you've got to satisfy that the person has published information and that information has sufficient reach in order for it to be contempt of court. So that if you're just speaking to your neighbors, you shouldn't be charged, you know what I mean, with breach of reporting restrictions because you're just talking to your neighbors and that's not going to prejudice a jury. You know what I mean? So that might be part of the reason why they're doing that. They're just trying to show, look, this is a legitimate prosecution because he's got reach. Although interestingly, I don't think he'll get a jury. They're under contempt of court. That's just a judge.
Which begs the question: like, are the same? No, they're not because it's Scottish criminal court. Do you have any idea if the Scottish court is as prejudiced as the UK court that's dealing with Julian Assange, or for that matter, the same level of I don't know, prejudice before the fact that they did with not only with Julian but with like Tommy Robinson?
Well, that's interesting. Actually, I was thinking about the Tommy Robinson case before. I mean, in Tommy Robinson's case, he deliberately sought to violate the Contempt of Court Act and almost got these people's convictions voided, or no, would have resulted in voiding their trial. And these people who were almost certainly guilty of just grotesque violations of sexual assaults against young girls, could have gotten off on the basis of like, okay, well, the jury pool has been poisoned. So he was deliberately trying to martyr himself to say, oh, look, the establishment are coming down in defense of what he would call like Muslim rape gangs, right? So basically like British Asians of Muslim background who were engaged in sort of like sexual grooming of young girls. And it's like, well, no, these are just the reporting restrictions. It's like you're trying to get these people off. Right, the charges. And so yeah, it was legitimate, and he even said what I'm doing is illegal. So he admitted to this like on video form. So I mean, that was it's in that respect, he was deliberately trying to get, it's like a martyrdom complex with the far right elements here in British society. But in terms of judges, like, look, what kind of you'll get different types of judges. You'll have like decent Scottish judges, just like you'll have decent English judges and Irish judges as well, and American and all the rest of it. But you just have to ask yourself what it takes to become a judge. First of all, what type of people become lawyers? What kind of background? If you become a lawyer, more likely than not, it's because you kind of accept the legitimacy of the system, right? And then if you become a judge, well, first of all, what kind of people apply to become judges? And then what kind of people get accepted, right? It's not like you get voted in, right, by society at large after like a lengthy roundtable discussion of like your case history.
In a handful of places in the U.S., judges
Yeah.
are voted in.
I know that you have higher court judges where they are, but then that turns them into politicians where you got to campaign, right?
Absolutely.
And then that means they keep having to go. So you have the same problem that you have with politicians then, right? Which means that they become heavily politicized. So yeah. I'm not just saying that being voted in is a good thing. But what I'm saying is, I mean, in a sense, you get in, but you get voted in by, the pre-existing establishment. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like certain types of people and certain types of you. If you're going to be a radical, it's highly unlikely that you'll apply to be a judge, because there will be some like radical lawyers who like really want to challenge the very fabric of society to make it more democratic and what have you. You want to speak truth to power. You're much more likely, for example, to be a prosecutor than to come from a defense lawyer background if you're a judge and you come from a criminal law background.
Yeah.
Many of them come from corporate law backgrounds anyway. Corporate and commercial law is much more normal than criminal law.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do come from a criminal law background, much more likely to come from a prosecutorial background than a defense law background, which means that you're more likely to see things from the perspective of the state and from the establishment. It's just natural that is just going to be your perspective. And then for you to be selected then again as well, and for you to be upgraded, as it were, to become deal with more serious cases up to then, high court and court of appeal. And then, of course, if you aspire to go up the ranks as well, then you will, you don't want to be overturned too many times in the wrong direction, right? You don't want to be constantly coming down against the government and then being overturned by what is relatively conservative court of appeal judges on points of law. If that happens too often, and you desire to join the court of appeal one day, that you may understand that being overturned too many times with the court of appeal will mean that you don't have as good a chance to join the higher ranks of judges in the appellate system. So that's what I'm saying, is that like it's not about necessarily just individual judges. It's just about the system as a whole and how it replicates itself, if that makes sense, right? So it's so yeah, you will have excellent Scottish lawyers and defense lawyers and prosecutors and judges, within the framework, but then you also have people who are just as reactionary in Scotland as they are in England. I mean, at the end of the day, some of the staunchest British imperialists were Scottish.
No, that's a fair point. I think it's my personal view, and I'm over here and like I'm a freaking anarchist, but my personal viewpoint and my experience largely is that judges as a whole are functionaries of the authoritarian state. Like, very, very rarely have I encountered a judge who is there to interpret the law in an impartial manner, you know? So when it comes to a journalist like Craig Murray, or a publisher like Julian Assange, or an activist like Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, when people are speaking truth to power and then they come into a literal hall of power, the judge or magistrate that they're standing before, it is immediately the opposition and not an impartial arbiter of what is and isn't legal.
I would definitely say that the difference between theory and practice, and even how, don't get me wrong, many of these people probably think they are impartially interpreting the rules. And I would also say that you might be an impartial, from a certain perspective, impartial arbiter of the rules, but there's also the rules themselves, right? The rules themselves might be rubbish. Right? So even the mere application of rules within the guidance that you have and the case law that you have and the precedents that you have could end up easily result in sort of unfair rulings. Yeah, it is. If you grew up like I did on things like Law and Order and The Practice, these television shows, which I loved, and just like, you know, these really difficult cases of trying to decide, well, we allow this evidence which was illegally obtained, even though the psycho serial head chopper is so blatantly guilty, and he's got like 50 severed heads in his basement, and the judge and the prosecutor and the defense lawyer each trying to hash it out. Will it be allowed? Because the state cannot be permitted to engage in an unlawful search and seizure. If you allow this piece of evidence, well, then where will it lead us all? So, and in reality, judges bend over backwards to allow evidence when it's illegally obtained. There might have been a short time period when these rules first came out, and then what ended up happening is people just assumed that these brief breaks, breaks on power represented the norm because of the media, quite frankly, and because of television and all the rest of it. And you'd hear certain cases of evidence being thrown out, and you start thinking that that's normal. And you realize, no, that's only normal when you have multi-million pounds legal teams and you come from a certain class of people. Then all of a sudden it becomes really important how legally obtained the evidence was. If you come from a different class of people in society, then you discover these arguments of fruit from the poisonous tree and all the rest of it, and reasonable suspicion and probable cause kind of go out the window quite often. But I'll just end with a quote that a socio-legal professor gave to me when I asked him about the rule of law. And he said to me, look, while the rule of law may challenge the system in certain points, in certain aspects, and we were talking about, we're in a capitalist system. So he said the rule of law here may challenge capitalism to a certain extent. Ultimately, it exists to perpetuate the establishment status quo, the status quo of the system, the political, social, and economic status quo. That's, in practice, that's what the rule of law exists to perpetuate. Set aside like the quotes from Washington and all the John Locke and all the others, where they say everybody has to be treated equally, and no secret tribunals, no secret trials. Those are cornerstones of the rule of law. Ultimately, the rule of law exists to maintain the system, the system within which that we live, rather than to constantly challenge power. And it may sometimes allow the challenging of power, and we do see it. We do see judges sometimes coming out saying this part of the surveillance rules are unlawful, or these police have gone too far. Because that's, quite frankly, that's part of the system as well. Like the ruling class has allowed these rules to be passed, and they for reasons of legitimacy. In fact, we can then move on to the subjects that we're about to discuss. For reasons of legitimacy, you need to allow these rules to be enforced, even if it's only once in a while. But and we can discuss that to a certain extent, how that's reflected in the elite labor report, And then briefly, there's some, or in surveillance, for example, powers in the UK, which I know we're about to discuss.
Absolutely. I think now would be a great time to bring in our next guest, Kitty Hundel. Kitty has a new book out that is, I believe, a fictionalized memoir. But from what I read in the Medium article that she has, it is based on real events that happened in her life, to her family and herself. Kitty, you can explain this much better than me. So if you would please let us know what you have going on. It's good to see you here on the vigils, by the way. I think I've only interacted with you through Unity for J stuff.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you. We can't see you at all. I don't know if that's intentional.
No, my webcam, normally I don't come on webcam anyway, but right now it's broken. So all you'll see is a white square, which is what you saw when I came in initially.
Mm-hmm.
I was experimenting with XSplit and it destroyed my webcam.
Ah.
Yeah, I think it's possible because I downloaded that one as well. Yeah, I did remove it, but it got worse. I'm kind of stuck now, but basically, getting to the book, I've put two links into the chat. One is the article I wrote on Profunk, which was basically blacklisting in Canada in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, up until 1983. The second link is my website, which if you click on the books menu, it will take you to my books website. And that has information about my book and about me. There's a biography there and things like that. Essentially, I come from a family of radicals, like we're, I guess, third generation troublemakers, you know. My dad was a freedom fighter, and he was known as the Red Pimpernel by the British because of his ability to evade their detection of their spies. He was very good at hiding from them. My uncle founded one of the largest hard left organizations in Canada in the 1970s. And he was also behind the founding of similar organizations in the US, Ireland, England, and the Caribbean and India. So my father and my uncle were very well known to the intelligence agencies in the UK and Canada. They were very much targets in the sense that they were both very likely on the Profunk lists. And the Profunk lists included family. They included relatives, they included friends, co-workers, and they included people in the liberal left. They didn't limit themselves to the hard left, like the communists or the anarchists. They included people like Tommy Douglas, who was the father of Canada's public health care. They included the clerk of the Privy Council, Robert Rabinovich. I believe Trudeau was even on the list at one point, our prime minister, not the current prime minister, but his father, who was prime minister in the 70s and 60s in Canada. So they were pretty extensive. They had literally thousands and thousands of people on them. I filed a FOIA and was rejected. My request was rejected on privacy grounds, which I haven't bothered to appeal. It's ridiculous because all they have to do is redact the other names, right? But I haven't bothered to appeal because I've had so much experience with this kind of garbage. Essentially, what happens with people like me is that none of the rules apply to you. The law does not apply to you. And your life is put under a microscope. And you are set up for numerous things to be made to look a certain way. So your history gets rewritten. Your history as a person in society gets completely rewritten. So the person that they have invented and claim that I am is a completely different person than I actually am. So that's the strategy that has been implemented for years. Now, why they targeted me and not my siblings or not my other relatives, I don't know. I've studied the person who was doing it to try to get an understanding of who he was. And essentially, he's a psychopath. He's a pedophile. He's hardcore sexist, hardcore racist. So, you know, I guess I can assume that he targeted me because of all of those things. My sister was way too young, and there wouldn't have been anything for him to gain by targeting her. Same with my younger brother. My older brother would have been a real challenge for him because my older brother was very political. He was a very political person, very strategic. So he would have been a real challenge. So I have to assume that's why I got picked. I don't know, really. I'm just guessing. So basically the book goes into all of the different things that happened to me in the 1980s. And that was during the COINTELPRO era in the US. Well, it was at the end of the COINTELPRO era in the US and Canada's RCMP Dirty Tricks era. So during the RCMP Dirty Tricks era, I was a target. But then after that, the targeting continued. So I don't doubt that in the US, the COINTELPRO targeting also continued. Basically, I think we were all lied to when we thought that after having the Church Committee hearings and the MacDonald Commission hearings in Canada, that all of this was ending and the problem was fixed. No, it wasn't. What they did in Canada was that they made a lot of the stuff legal. So when the RCMP were illegally accessing people's mail without a warrant, that was made legal. So when CSIS was founded as the solution to the dirty tricks, CSIS was allowed to have CSIS had warrantless access to your mail. CSIS also had warrantless access to people's medical records. So for a long time, I wondered why they would have access to people's medical records, unless they were up to doing bad things. And given my experience with the medical system in Canada, then I have to assume that that was why they were given the okay to interfere with people medically as well as in other ways. So to interfere with the mail. I have never had my mail come to my door directly, ever, in my entire life. It always takes double the time to get to my door as it does to get to my neighbor's door, for example. And I've actually tested that out. So the purpose of the book, especially for the current times, it's a warning. It's to show people this is the kind of stuff that they do. Now, in the 1980s, 90s, 2000, there were only a small handful of people that were targeted that way. After 9/11, the numbers expanded. After 2010, with Occupy movement and Stop TPP movements, the numbers really expanded. And then from 2015, as we saw in New Zealand, as Susie has told us many times, they've expanded out to child abuse victims, earthquake insurance victims, the general public, right? And now they've also expanded out in the sense that they're using private contractors more. It's become a profit-making business, which means that there's an incentive not only to expand the number of targets, but to target those people for a much longer time. There's a financial incentive to do that now. So the point of the book is to alert activists on the kind of things that they're going to see happen to them. It's a very dystopian world you're going to live in if you become a target. And all of the things that were done to me in the 80s, 90s, 2000s are happening to these activists like Liz, like Susie, like Julian Assange, like Jacob Appelbaum. They're all experiencing the same kinds of interferences in their lives, the same kind of intensity. Basically, there's two approaches. One is to well, actually, the main one is to put your life under a microscope. They put you under a microscope and they spin every single thing they can find in a negative way into a negative way. The other thing that they do is what you're seeing with Craig Murray, which is that they have taken a situation that he has, they've taken all of his writings as a journalist. They've taken that law and they've applied the law to his writings in a microscopic way. So they're looking for every tiny little bit detail that they can use against him. And it has nothing to do with whether he's actually violating the spirit of the contempt of court law or not. It has to do with what they can get him on, right? So there's a general approach. And I think it's really important for young activists today to understand what that general approach is. And it's actually important for everyone in society to start to understand what that general approach is, because they are not going to know if they become a target. If you are an earthquake insurance applicant and all of a sudden your life starts going to hell, are you going to know that you're a target unless you have already been educated on what these agencies are doing to people? So that's the point of the book. The reason I say it's fictionalized, the character Rita is me. Rita's story is 99% true. There's a few things I fudged. The other stories in it, Greta's story, which I've included because she was a target of the same people in the 1950s, as early as the 1950s. Cameron from MK Ultra was involved in her targeting. I suspect she actually ended up in Cameron's psychiatric hospital. The other people are information that I've picked up from talking to people who know them. So the stories may or may not be true. They're witness testimony, but it's secondhand from my point of view, right?
If I could, let's kind of hold on or focus on the surveillance aspects of this, because I know that Mohammed, who has short time here, definitely can add to the aspects of that. And you did mention Liz Muller. Liz was gracious enough to join us on Thursday night. The specific targeting and surveillance that she was under and that Susie was under for their work in opposing a trade deal it is so over the top and out of hand and cartoonish that it's worth spending a few moments on. Mo, could you jump in for a moment, please?
Yeah, so many interesting things there. I always found that discussion very interesting, that description, including of the legalization of previous practices which were illegal. I was literally just thinking about how the Investigatory Powers Act here in the UK was passed after the revelations made by Edward Snowden. And one of the things that it did, it created a tribunal, a secret tribunal, which oversees the use of, if you want to challenge certain surveillance practices by MI6 or MI5, or if warrants are to be obtained, or even surveillance practices engaged in without warrants. Now they use the Investigatory Powers Act. But what the act does is legalize mass surveillance activities engaged in by public authorities, especially security services, as they're known here, which were exposed by Edward Snowden. So that's exactly what we had over here, which is it was exposed that they were engaged in these practices without legal basis, mass, indiscriminate, as well as discriminate surveillance practices without legal basis. And what happened was a law was passed to say, okay, much, if not all of this is now legal. So that's what we experienced here as well. I found it interesting to hear that you had similar experiences in Canada.
Well,
So that's just on. Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say
No, go ahead.
even worse because Canada in 2015 passed a law that allows CSIS to engage in warrantless disrupt and destroy campaigns. So they can come at a person in the same way that Susie is being targeted, that Liz is being targeted, that I'm being targeted. They can do it without a warrant, as long as they stay within the confines of the law. Well, CSIS has warrantless access to your mail. They have warrantless access to your medical files. There's a whole lot of damage they can do within the law, right? Now, if they bring other people in, then they have to get a warrant. But the warrant is, the warrants go to judges that are very sympathetic in the first place. All CSIS
well, what kind of judge? Yeah, what kind of judge becomes a surveillance judge in the first place? It's like we have the same thing here with our surveillance courts, right? There's a judge who's overseeing an inquiry into surveillance. And actually, I'll discuss that. Oh, I can mention that actually, because there is a public inquiry here into the use of surveillance and infiltration practices by these. This is after numerous sort of outrages were revealed in the press. But the judge that they've appointed, well, first there was a Court of Appeal judge, and he died, sadly. And he's a Court of Appeal judge, so he's a member of the establishment. But compared to the judge who died, the new judge was literally a former judge in a secret court which permitted secret evidence brought against applicants, non-state actors who couldn't see the evidence brought against them. So it's like, oh, of all the judges you pick this one. Of course, he's going to already inherently accept the legitimacy of a very intrusive surveillance system. So sorry, I just wanted to mention that because that is exactly the critiques I've had here.
Yeah, that's actually very, very important. Basically, all they do in Canada is they just come up with fabricate a way of identifying you as a terrorist. So if they can come up with a way of applying that terrorist label to you, then anything goes in Canada. Literally anything goes.
And this is something that we just had happen here with our 2020 or 2019 National Defense Authorization Act, where hacktivists, leaktivists, and public disclosure outlets now all fall under that umbrella of terrorism. So WikiLeaks is an organization. Outlets that break news, or even independent content creators that are putting information out that is, I don't know, either obtained via leaks or reporting on that information that was obtained via leaks, can now be charged and indefinitely detained for proliferating that information.
Now to add another second component to that, I don't know if people have been following what's been happening with these women who were targeted by the Epstein network, but I've been following them for a little while. And what's really starting to sink in with me is that there's a very close connection here that we should not dismiss between what happened in those Epstein networks, the connection to the intelligence agencies, and the connections to influential people. These networks are being used to leverage influential people into doing things that are illegal and corrupt and amount to abuses of power. So it's actually, and that in the context of mass surveillance, it's a package. You have to look at it as a single package, because when you add mass surveillance to that, and when you add targeting to that, those are the same people that are engaging in those activities as well. I don't think it was an accident that Adelson was it was Adelson's computers that UC Global used to transfer data to the CIA. We know that Adelson is part of this Epstein network. We know that Wexner is part of this Epstein network. So how do those connections fit in? This is something, there's still gaps. There's still lots of questions in that, but it's something that we have to really keep in mind, because I think my instincts are telling me that's really, really important. And it's something that hasn't been leaked. We haven't had a whistleblower come out other than these young women who were sexually exploited. But the stories that some of them are telling are very, very, they're not talking about the salacious details of, you know, these sextortion rings. What they're talking about is the politics behind what's going on. They're talking about what's happening to them because they have come out in the open and identified these people and identified what is going on with them. They're being targeted in the same way that I'm being targeted, Susie, Liz, and others. So there's the mass surveillance is an important thing, because the mass surveillance is telling us is that they're not creating special targets anymore. They want to be able to go after everybody this way, and the mass surveillance enables them to do that. That, combined with, you know, things like the NDAA, or in Canada, the Anti-Terrorist Act. I don't know what it's called in the UK. Those acts, combined with all these other little pieces of the picture, are showing that we have already walked into dystopia. We're already there. This is not something that's coming in the future.
If I could actually bring that just a connection with what you mentioned earlier, Steve, about people who opposed TTIP and TPP being targeted for surveillance. I think if you look at the history of surveillance, including in the UK, I'll give that as an example, but I'm sure you'll find all kinds of examples in the United States as well. You find that there are the two main types of surveillance in terms of using the overall system to engage in a form of mass surveillance, right? So if you have one of the oldest public bodies here, longest standing bodies in the UK, is the post office. And you know, there was a unit which used to steam open letters, for example, from the colonies, like all of them, right? To see about people discussing dissent or plans to basically just to see what is going on in those letters. So that's a form of mass surveillance, because if you're targeting entire class of people, and that would be steaming open letters, reading them, and then closing them back up again and letting them make their way back to the intended recipient. And then, of course, when you had telecoms first being introduced, you also had mass surveillance via those telecoms, right? It wasn't till after the Church Committee hearings that you ended up having the FISA court being set up, and criminalization of corporate involvement as well in surveillance, warrantless surveillance, which was then retroactively immunized, I think, with the Bush or the Obama administration, after it was exposed that after 9/11, they all violated all the laws put in effect after church. So that's the mass surveillance aspect. That goes back as far as post. But you will always have targeted surveillance. So I wrote an article in 2017 called, was it Spying, Surveillance, and Sabotage? What will it take to bring an end to political policing? And in it, I try to show historical examples, as well as different examples of surveillance, of targeted surveillance of organizations, infiltration, anti-war, environmental, social justice organizations, engage in what the system itself declares to be legal. So officially speaking, these organizations being targeted for infiltration, surveillance, and sabotage are engaged in activities that, officially speaking, they are legal. So, and they're not being targeted and sabotaged because they're worried that they're going to engage in terrorist activities. So as long as you've had the state, you will have surveillance, and you'll have targeting of groups which are seen to be challenging of of a class-based system, right, of certain interests. So that will include corporate interests. So it's not surprising to me when you put that into context that people who challenge TPP, which was not, it's not just a trade deal, it's a deal that involves, hundreds of billions of pounds worth of potential corporate profits, and globally speaking, or hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's a deal that was being pushed by the U.S. government, right? So it's by the U.S. government in conjunction with corporations. So it's people who oppose power. The more you oppose power, the more likely you're going to be specifically targeted, and then that's where the mass surveillance powers come in handy for those, because they now have access to information that they otherwise wouldn't have. So it's twofold. There will always be individual targeted surveillance because you can just get more out of it. If somebody you think they're your friend, or targeting neighbors, targeting organization members, or what have you, including just to sabotage organizations, right? If for no other reason. So it's you'll have both. So people can check out the article, some of the things I used to publish on that. I note that the Metropolitan Police admit that over the last 40 years, 400 groups. This is just the Metropolitan Police, right? This is not any of the other police departments. This is not MI5 or MI6 or branches of the military. Have targeted 400 groups, and now they've admitted it's actually 1,000 in the UK, or at least in England and Wales. So there's 1,000 organizations, almost invariably on the left. Sometimes they'll be on the right, but invariably on the left. Have been spied on since the 60s up to 2014 or 2015. And because of various revelations that came out time and time again in the press, recently over the last 7 years, a public inquiry was set up to investigate this. And the judge that they've appointed currently, the current judge, is a former spy court judge, a judge who's used to overseeing cases where they're like security courts, if you like, that were essentially created not that long ago. They have yet to hear evidence. This is like going on now the fifth year, and they have yet to get into the meat of the subject matter. It's constant delays on the part of the police. Oh, we think that the police who are undercover shouldn't be named. Their names should be redacted. It's a constant battle, right? Because a great many women have discovered here that their partners, including in some cases fathering children with, turns out that these were undercover police officers. And the police officers, the people would disappear, and like, what the fuck happened to my partner who came over for Thanksgiving or ate with the family over Christmas, and who I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with, and just disappeared. And it turns out that there is a member of Special Branch or Special Branch is now closed. So it's the replacement, or National Public Order Extremism Unit. I mean, these coming up with the more convoluted names, but I can't remember what the current name is of these units. And we keep being told it's closed down, they won't do it anymore, and then we open a new unit with a more convoluted name. And so it's completely outrageous. And these people aren't being accused. It's not like you're safeguarding the country from terrorism. I had to have sex with her, Your Honor, in order to find out what she knows about this ticking bomb. Right? It's literally people that they admit, or these are like environmental activists and people who campaign against the arms trade and people who oppose fox hunting, which itself is a crime in this country anyway, right? Fox hunting. But there you go. So it's built into the system. Surveillance is built into the system, and it's one of the core functions of the Metropolitan Police Force, or police service, which is the very first modern police service. So surveillance was built into the very DNA of the first modern police force in order to prevent trouble to the establishment later on, 140 years ago, 150 years ago when it was first created. So the idea is that you would have a civil police force that was respected and professional, that could undermine things before they boiled up and exploded, right? So you get organizations, get possible dissent when it's still budding.
So
yeah.
What I was going to say about that was that you've really nailed it there, because what they're doing is they're actually systematizing it even more, right? So it's becoming systematized to the point where they're working together in Canada. The way it looks, and I could be wrong, but this is my assessment of what I've seen, is that DOD is involved, CSE, CSIS, right, and private contractors. And all the agencies work together and are working on bringing in the community for to participate. So recently we had DOD making a call out to members of the general public to participate in what they called a training program for their staff on surveillance. Well, they don't need the general public to come in and get trained on surveillance so that their staff can get trained on surveillance. You know what I mean? What they're actually doing is they're training the general public on surveillance. That's what they're doing. And so, but they can't say that because there might be outrage. So
no, you're absolutely right, though. There's an app or a website or whatever called Nextdoor. I don't know if it's over in the UK or up in Canada, but everybody has a Nextdoor neighborhood, and it's a snitch brigade, is what it is. The mayor of New York put out a hotline for where people can snitch on their neighbors who are violating coronavirus restrictions. Now, to their credit, New Yorkers responded wonderfully by sending Mayor de Blasio dick pics and pictures of their middle fingers, but to the point that where it like overloaded it. But you're absolutely right. The public is being trained to snitch. The public is being trained to spy, and they're being conditioned to feel good about it. A release of dopamine takes place when they rat out their neighbor, or they rat out their enemy, or they rat out a random stranger. It's the kind of cultural conditioning and I hate to use the term because it's getting thrown around everywhere, but it is Orwellian. It's what the people were taught to do in that book, and we're living it right now.
It's very East German. What we're told was the Stasi way of doing things, where people get put into a state of fear that they have to kind of report, that you wouldn't have conversations even in front of your kids because what they're being told in school, you don't want them to snitch on you. I didn't hear that about the mayor of New York. I should say that we've had police departments here where police chiefs of different police departments have suggested it, have specifically called for it. Actually, not all of them, but we've had them. It was on the news. Our mayor of London, thankfully, has not done that. I think quite wisely, because he'd probably get a similar reaction. Look, I get the fact that if you have an epidemic, it's a problem if people violate sort of certain rules that are meant to keep us healthy and sort of defeat the purpose of the lockdown. But at the same time, having, it's absolutely awful for social cohesion if you start turning people into snitches. What's it going to do for long-term societal relationships and neighborly relationships? And if I found out that my neighbor did that with me, I would be very, very upset. And I think that could go well beyond the lockdown. You know what I mean? Right?
It's cultural conditioning that's being done right now. It's very much cultural conditioning to get people to accept this. So you give them a legitimate reason to accept being a snitch. And then when it comes to after the legitimate reason is over, that culture continues, and the structures that are built to enable that culture continue. We saw that in legislation that was being passed, they called it anti-bullying legislation. But what it was really doing was giving warrantless access to everybody across Canada's internet access. So every ISP in Canada would have been obligated to give information about their users to the police. Now, okay, yes, we don't like bullying. That doesn't mean you give warrantless access to the police. You know, for internet access, police still have to have grounds. You know, they should still require a warrant. There's no reason to make that warrantless. But that's the approach, is to take a legitimate reason. Oh, we're fighting pedophiles. Well, do they need to do that to fight pedophiles? No. And will they succeed in fighting pedophiles that way? No. The way they'll succeed in fighting pedophiles is infiltrating pedophile websites and targeting those, right?
You know that's used, by the way, here in the UK as well. I mean, and it's so obvious to me when they do it, but I have to remember that it's not necessarily obvious to everybody for whom surveillance has been like a lifelong issue. Because when there's been our NSA, everybody knows the NSA. Our version is the GCHQ, right? Government Communications Headquarters. So GCHQ, and they're the body which engages in mass surveillance here. And whenever there's criticism, or whenever there's a law, an expanded power being pushed here to probably further legalize what they're already doing in practice secretly, we're told, oh, this is going to be necessary to target pedophiles. It's like, really? So this massive this massive system that's been set up during the Second World War, just after, to spy on foreign powers, to protect the country from, like, during the Second World War and then the emergent Cold War era, right, is actually really about targeting local pedophiles. That's fascinating. And is it actually necessary? Couldn't you just have a pedophile unit which has specific rules and powers specifically for them, if that's the case? Like, do you really need to be able to spy on 65 million residents of the UK? But that's all they do. They'll throw it out there because they know that it takes far much more time to critique the system that is already accepted as normal. It makes it sound like you're against targeting pedophiles.
Yeah.
And it's something they're doing right now with the Earn It Act in the US, the Earn IT. Essentially what it does is just destroy end-to-end encryption. It makes it so websites, if they host content that's ruled not good by the government, that website can be sued or just litigated out of existence. And there's actually a petition, if we could get that pulled up so everyone could take a look at it, to reach out to say no against this Earn It Act, because it's something that's going to basically destroy the fabric of the internet and destroy end-to-end encryption, because everything would have to pass through a content observer and basically record all of your information as it's being sent and before it gets sent. So if you could, we'll drop that in the chat too. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, because it's been, I don't know, a lot of awesome discussions that we've gotten able to fit into this hour here. If you could you and Kitty Mo both give some final thoughts and where people can find you?
Well, if you're interested in my book, you can find it on kittyhundle.com. If you're interested in reading, I'm doing research into the spy agencies, history in Canada and the things that they've done. You can take a look at that Medium article. Really, people need to be alert to these issues, and that's what I'm trying to do. I want people to be aware of what's going on. I want activists to exercise a lot of caution, because we are already in a very dystopian era, and we're moving into a much darker one. And really, for your protection, you really need to be smart, you need to be aware, and you need to be careful.
Yeah, I would say, well, just made a bit of an update. So it was recently revealed there's a memo that's been discovered, I think first published by The Guardian, or first reported on by The Guardian newspaper, but I found the memo as well, which is, it's a ministerial memo by British government ministers calling for the addition of 5 more public bodies that will have access to our metadata under the Investigatory Powers Act, which we discussed at the beginning of this discussion, which we had said legalized much of the mass indiscriminate surveillance that was first revealed by Edward Snowden, or legalized it here in Britain. So they were engaged in it previously outside of the law, and then the Investigatory Powers Act legalized much of it and said, okay, they've got to apply for warrants, or they don't need warrants in many cases. So they're adding 5 public bodies, and it's just for people to be aware of, I suppose, Civil Nuclear Constabulary, who are responsible for guarding nuclear-related facilities, and the Environment Agency, the Insolvency Service, the UK National Authority for Counter-Eavesdropping, a great name, and the Pensions Regulator. So yeah, just further public bodies that they're saying will have access to it. And the reason this is significant is, look, when they passed this law, it was like, this is necessary to defend us against terrorism. 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 Yeah. Now, when you read the memorandum and it justifies why it's necessary for them, basic criminal justice arguments. So, okay, mass surveillance, metadata analysis, all these other things that we're told is the most extreme powers, but only for the most urgent and most necessary of cases. It's just the mass normalization of these emergency extreme powers. And so just to be aware, people should be aware that powers which come in on an emergency basis have a habit of becoming permanent even after so-called emergency time periods. It doesn't mean that the emergency isn't real. It just means that we should be very cautious about simply accepting power grabs because rights once lost are very difficult to be regained, and in certain respects took hundreds of years to gain them in the first place. You can find my work at MLMozzie on Twitter. I publish with The Canary and Sputnik International, mostly currently, but I've also published with The Grey Zone and with Open Democracy, and have my own website, which is theinterregnum.net, which is just my own blog for now. And yeah, those are the main places to be finding my work currently. And I'll tweet out my articles whenever I publish them.
Cool. Thank you guys very much again for joining us. And I would like to thank everybody in the audience for sticking with us and listening to the conversations. You can find us on Twitter at action_4 Assange. Thanks to one of our awesome supporters behind the scenes, Kimber, we now have a Facebook set up, which is facebook.com/action4 Assange. We do stream live on Rockfin now too. And I recommend everyone start looking at that as an alternative platform to receive information from YouTube. But yeah, my name's Andrew Smith. You can find me on Twitter at Andrew Zigman. And thank you guys again.
If you're just seeing me for the first time, my name is Steve Poikinen. I host a show called Slow News Day. You can find that here on YouTube by typing in Slow News Day Podcast into the search bar. I am very recently also on Rockfin. Rockfin is vastly preferable, in my opinion, to YouTube, both in the way that they interact with creators and in the way that they interact with the audience. You can sign up for a free account and you can view all of the content that isn't premium on there for all the creators. If you endorse me for $9.99 a month, you then get access to the premium content of those creators and mine as well. It's basically like becoming a patron on Patreon, but instead of one creator, you get access to all of them. You can find me absolutely there on the Rockfin. On Twitter, I am at Slow News Day Show. I have a much neglected Facebook page of the same name. And just thank you very much for being here with us today. We love you guys. Thank you, Mohammed Almazi, to Kitty Hundel. We will try and get Alex from Red Star Radio on at some point. I'm unsure what happened to him today. I hope he's doing well. Sleepy Josh on the 1s and 2s, and Mean Panda on the graphics. That's going to do it for us. We will see you Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central, with our guests Kevin Zeese and Danny Schurenson of Fortress on a Hill. That will be an incredible panel, so do not miss that. And until then, good luck to us all.